started with. It says, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. And we know that people literally follow Jesus, but we can't literally do that in the sense of following him bodily. We can literally do that as he still lives and reigns in the sense of imitating who we know him to be and following his very much living commands and expectations in his word. And so we got to learn from him. That's what discipleship is. And people talk about discipleship in the world, and they really don't even know about Jesus. They know the highlights. They know maybe some miracles. They know he died. They know he was raised from the dead. But as far as his doctrine, his ethics, for lack of a better way of putting it, just the way that he was as a person, exuding righteousness and living as one who is the light. They really don't know a lot of specifics about that, but that's what discipleship is. It's not just a romantic vision that we have of who we think Christ is, but it's very much an objective thing that we either submit to and become a disciple of, or we reject. And so we got to learn about him. I mentioned turn to Acts chapter 11 because we looked at that text. You remember disciples were first called Christians in Antioch, verse 26. And notice how all that connects with learning and then applying. It says, this is after, of course, Cornelius and his household were obedient to the gospel, and the Jews questioned that, and Peter explained to the Jews and defended God's grace in the first half of chapter 11. And then in verse 19, it says that persecution that scattered people abroad led to them preaching the word, but only to the Jews. But then some preached the Lord Jesus to the Hellenists, so those who weren't Jews, those who were Gentiles. They believed and turned to the Lord. News, verse 22, reached the church in Jerusalem, so they sent Barnabas. He came, saw the grace of God, so the teaching that they had believed and obeyed had an outward effect. He could see the difference, not in how they appeared as a person, but how they acted. Definitely the joy that they had, the change of life that they were exhibiting. And so he encouraged them to continue with the Lord. And then in verse 26, they taught a great many people, and disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. The discipleship amounts to them learning of Jesus, following Jesus, imitating Jesus, leaving all to forsake all and leaving it to follow Jesus, as we've already studied, suffering for Jesus even, and continuing with Jesus. And these disciples were not called Baptists or Catholics or Lutherans or Presbyterians. They were called Christians, and that's important because that's who we're a disciple of. So, to that end, discipleship demands that we learn from Christ, that we follow him by learning from him. In John 8 and verse 31, he said, if you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed. In that very context, and you might just turn there in John chapter 8, in that very context, he is speaking to some Jews who believed in him, verse 31. Jesus said to those Jews who believed him, and so some think that mere belief amounts to discipleship. And we had James 2 brought up last class, if you remember. I forget who brought it up. But the point was made that James makes that even the demons believe and tremble. But are they disciples of Jesus? No. So these Jews, many believed in him. And so he, kind of like what we saw in Luke chapter 14, and we'll look at that text again this evening. As people followed him, a great multitude followed him, he stopped, turned around, and he told them what discipleship actually was. They're following him. They believe in him to a degree, as do the Jews here. But he says, if you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And so in abiding in his doctrine, his word, everything that he teaches, everything that he is and exhibits in his life and directs in regard to relation to his Father is something we must believe and submit to. That's what discipleship is. It's really an all-or-nothing thing. We can't just take and leave things. We can't pick and choose. Comments, questions to that end? That's kind of where we left off. We got somewhere to look at in that particular point. I'm going to try to do better. I overlooked some people who had some comments last time. All right, Matthew chapter 11. Yeah, James.
Well, I was thinking about 8:31 in John.
Yes.
Talking about, and I appreciate that you could actually go all the way back to John 6:63, where you said, "Word did I speak to their spirit, their life."
Right.
And actually, we go all the way through chapter 10. It's almost the same thing throughout there about teaching and learning and listening.
Right.
And paying attention and hearing. You hear that in chapter 10 when he's talking about the sheep.
Yes, sir.
The sheep hear my voice, they know my voice, and
Yeah.
they follow me. And I was just thought, he kind of almost capped it with that. And it's an amazing thing. Sheep, they have to be led. They have to be taught. They have to be guided where they got to go.
And by hear, he doesn't just mean audibly, but listen and obey.
And it's an obedience, and it's an immediate obedience. That they would take their flocks together in a huge pasture,
Right.
and they would mix them all together.
Yeah.
And the one shepherd would call out, and only his sheep would come out, these thousands of sheep. And that's the point he's
Yeah.
making through that.
That's an excellent picture.
And that knowledge of knowing who that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good point that kind of follows through the next few chapters. In chapter 7, he mentioned, drinking that water of life, and it'll spring up into an everlasting fountain. And speaking of the Holy Spirit, of course, revealing the will of God. So that certainly is a point that continues. I actually told a fib. Matthew 28 is the next text, and we kind of alluded to that last time. But remember in the Great Commission, he said, make disciples by baptizing them, but then what did he follow up with? What are we supposed to do after we convert someone by baptizing them into Christ? Yeah. Teach them to observe all that Jesus has commanded us, and them, of course. And so, if we're truly making disciples and not just adding to a number or getting people wet, making some tallies off of our, record, how many people that we've converted, then we're going to teach them furthermore. And that's something, by the way, when Jesus turns to the multitudes in Luke 14, a lot of people would think, and they would admit to this, of course, but the way a lot of people think exhibits that they would suggest that was an unwise thing for Jesus to do, because if he's telling them count the cost, he's going to scare a lot of people away, isn't he? And so let's get them baptized first, and then we'll break the news to them. That's never how it's been done. There's always a count the cost situation before there is the immersion for the forgiveness of sins, and then a follow-up on that. This is the details. These are the details of the cost. And so we got to teach them. So Matthew chapter 11, if someone doesn't mind, read verse 29 and 30 of Matthew chapter 11, which makes this similar point. Matthew 11, 29, 30.
Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
All right, thank you. So he mentions, and specifically what he emphasizes there in the book is learn from me. So that's key. But I want us to notice that point, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. What does that represent? What does he mean by take my yoke upon you? Larry?
You become my follower, and then you continue to learn.
Right.
It's an ongoing process.
You become a follower and continue to learn. When you think of a yoke, that kind of paints a picture for us. There's a parallel and illustration there. What is that? Yeah, take up his burden. So it's similar to even take up your cross, right? It's a matter of him controlling us and us bearing the load that he calls us to bear. And I'm glad we made that connection. There's one time I made that point, and someone was asking, does he mean like an egg yolk? And that's not what he means. It's a Y-O-K-E. And it's to that point of learning, because it's not a literal yoke, but it's the idea of a beast of burden having that yoke upon him and pulling a cart or plowing a field. And the farmer is in control. The animal is doing what the farmer is directing him to do. And when that yoke is upon that animal, it is under the control of its master, and it does what the master tells it to do and goes where the master tells it to go, and therefore accomplishes the work that the master has put him to do. And so you take that responsibility, and there is a burden, but he says it's light, and so that in comparison to sin. And so that's why John says my commandments, or his commandments, are not burdensome, 1 John 5 and verse 3, and that's important. Larry, you have something? So learn from him to do his will. And notice in Luke chapter 6 and verse 46, it's the next text that he brings up, one that we're familiar with, but I want us to notice some of the context there. He says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say?" Now, question number 11, or rather, yes, 11, what does it mean to call Jesus Lord? So he's driving a point home here of inconsistency. What is that point? Authority. In word, they're acknowledging his authority. In action, they're not. And so you call him Lord, that means you are at least giving assent to his superiority and his supreme authority. And if that is truly your belief, then your actions will follow your words. So notice back there in verses 43 through 45, he mentions a good tree does not bear bad fruit, but a bad tree, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree is known by its fruit. Do men gather figs from thorns, or do they gather grapes from a bramble bush? A good man, he says in verse 45, out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good. An evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. And so you're going to know a tree by its fruits, and part of that is your speech, because someone says something and they say, "Oh, that's not really who I am." But what it does is it manifests your heart. It tells us who you actually are. And I think here in verse 46, you kind of got the inverse of that. You've got some people saying a lot of things that are manifesting who they are, because it's not lining up with the teaching of God. And then you've got some people saying things that sound right, Lord, Lord, and then their actions, the fruit, is not matching up with their speech. And so, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say? Discipleship is learning from him as master teacher and following what he says. But notice what that includes in verse 48. This is something that Matthew's record doesn't include a little detail in Luke 6. He says, this man, or verse 48, this man who hears the sayings and does them, is like a man building his house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the flood and stream arose vehemently against that house and could not shake it, it was founded on the rock. Notice that phrase, dug deep. When we're talking about discipleship as including learning from Christ, that takes hard work. Someone wonders, why couldn't Jesus have just told it to us in the most unmistakable way? Well, the thing is he did. It's unmistakable if you're an honest heart, and that's the point. It kind of weeds out the bad from the good. And discipleship is not supposed to just be easy. It's supposed to be something that shows our true love and devotion to him. In Acts 17, remember what Paul told the idolaters on Mars Hill. He said, God made from one blood every nation of men to dwell, appointed their pre-appointed boundaries and dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him. Groping and finding involves strenuous effort. I want to find him. I haven't yet. I need to get there. And we see that. Creation shows the evidence. And then we put two and two together and find out there's a creator. But we don't know much about his character and what he would have for us to do. So we seek him in his word, and we figure it out. And that's how God intended it, because the people who want to truly follow him are going to be able to find it. And the people who aren't as motivated, they're going to be weeded out, aren't they, Steve?
First thing I think of, Matthew 7:14. Wide is the gate.
Yeah.
Narrow is the way, and difficult. Hard is the way that leads to life, and few that find it.
That's an excellent point. It's a lot easier to just go with the flow and not really investigate things, isn't it? Remember what Paul told Timothy, be diligent to present yourself approved to God, rightly dividing the word of truth, right? Diligence, that's effort, exertion of energy. So great points there. Anyone else have any other point on number 3? DJ.
I thought of you can't serve two masters. When he says, why do you call me Lord, Lord?
Yeah.
Because, that's what that is. When you call the Lord, Lord, it means that's your master, that's who you're serving. And I think that's kind of another point to it. He's like,
Yeah.
Some remember.
Yeah, kind of riding the fence. In James 4, he calls them adulterers and adulteresses. And that would have definitely taken them aback, and especially, a Jewish audience in James who understands the graphic nature of that language with their ancestral history, that they were spiritual adulterers committing idolatry and were sent into captivity, and you're calling me an adulterer and adulteress? And it's because you can't love God and be friends of the world, because friendship with the world is enmity with God. And so if you call him Lord, Lord, that's a totality, and we need to live up to that claim. Anybody have anything else on learning from him? All right, fourth point is that discipleship demands that we bear fruit. So again, it's not an intellectual thing simply. It involves the intellect, which translates into a change of will. But then when you've had your will change, that is going to be demonstrated in your actions. You're going to bear fruit for Jesus. And so, of course, the place he first goes to is John chapter 15. You might turn there, and if someone's already there, if you would read verse 8 of John 15.
By this my Father is glorified, that ye bear much fruit, so you will be my disciples.
So you will be my disciples. So what is the proof of their discipleship? Bearing fruit. And it's the particular fruit. Galatians 5 stresses the fruit of the Spirit. And so everyone's bearing fruit, and you can point out who they belong to by identifying their fruit. Are you one who is Stoic or an Epicurean, follower of Epicurus? And they taught these different tenets, those philosophers, and you didn't have to be told. You could just see what they're saying, or hear what they're saying, or see what they're doing. And you can identify them with that man based on their fruit. And so it is with Jesus. It's not just claiming to be doing something in Jesus' name. In Colossians 3 and verse 17, as we recently studied, what does it mean to do all in the name of the Lord Jesus? Do what he authorizes. Do what he demands. And then any other thing that he's not demanding, it may be a liberty, but you're doing it in the sphere in which he's authorized. So I'm doing what he tells me to do, and that's what this bearing fruit is. So notice a couple of things in this context. He says, I am the true vine in verse 1. My Father is the vine dresser, and every branch in me that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit he prunes that it may bear more fruit. Not only is bearing fruit a manifestation of your discipleship, but it is such an integral part of it that without bearing fruit, you are useless to the Lord, and he's going to cast you out and burn you. And that's what he says there in verse 6. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. Discipleship is not discipleship, by definition, without deeds, without obedience, without doing things. And in this particular text, he points out that the source of your fruit is abiding in the vine. That's key. Because again, fruits that are identified tell us, without even having to see the tree, what the tree is. I pick up an apple, you know that it came from an apple tree. It's logical. It's very simple. Yet many in the religious world refuse to see that in spiritual matters. And that's what he's saying. You'll be bearing fruit, but as far as being my disciples, you cannot bear that kind of fruit without me. And it seems to go without saying, but it needs to be said. So notice what he says there in verse 4. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you, unless you abide in me. He says, I am the vine, and you are the branches. He who abides in me, and I in him, bears much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing. And he's not saying that you won't be capable of doing anything in your life. He's saying you can't do nothing insofar as it means to be my disciple without me. But what would that look like? What might be an example of, I'm trying to bear fruit and show that I'm a disciple of Jesus, but I'm doing it without him, and so it's an impossibility to be bearing fruit in his name. It's a loaded question. What does it mean to be trying to do this without Jesus?
I think it goes back to the tie-in that you kind of discussed at the beginning about, have you counted the cost?
Yeah.
that goes back then to Brother Gold's comment about then what do you look like? You look like the Lord. You look like the Father.
Yeah.
And so that is what is being then glorified and reflected on.
That's an excellent point. So Christianity is not about your vanity. It's not a philosophy to improve your life on earth and make people like you more. Though it may, it's not for that purpose. It's to glorify God. And so to have this empty shell of Christianity where you're going through the motions, you know the truth, but you're not doing it for the right reason, and you're not really bearing fruit for Jesus. That's an excellent point. Tyler?
I think too, when if somebody feels that they have a better method, a better idea of how the gospel should be taught, and
Sure.
it becomes a lot of anecdotal type of whatever. I mean, however somebody may do it, and they, in other words, they are trying to use the name of Jesus and go about it in a way that is completely different.
Right.
And I'm not saying different styles of preaching. I'm saying really venturing out on, well, this hasn't been successful. I'm going to try this other method.
Yeah.
To bring it down.
That's an excellent point. We're not getting anywhere with gospel meeting flyers. So we're going to throw a pizza party on there or ice cream social, and that brings them in. Then we preach them the gospel. But you're not really attracting who you want to attract. Jesus said that God draws people to Him by teaching. John 6. Yes, Larry.
And to add to all that, in Matthew 7, you have the example of someone who you have where the Lord says, many will say to me in that day, do we not cast out demons? Do we not do many mighty works in your name?
Yeah.
And God will say, I never knew you. So obviously, it must be done according to truth.
Right.
Whatever the fruit you're going to bear must be according to the truth of God. It ties into the learning part, so that you're not just out with a false religion
Yeah.
and claiming to follow Jesus, and Jesus says, "No,
That's an excellent point. Just the nominal aspect of it really doesn't amount to anything if you're not truly abiding in His teaching, His standard. Yes, Steve.
Just real quick on that too, Matthew 7 also, right after that, narrow is the way. He goes into talking about the fruits, and he says you're not going to get grapes from a thorn bush.
Yeah.
You could bear fruit, but it could be a thorn bush fruit, you know.
Right.
We want good fruit. That
Exactly.
come from God, not just bad fruit.
Exactly. And, think about this, too. In Galatians 5, it's called the fruit of the Spirit. And if you've said this, it's okay, but we need to realize the implications. I've heard people say before that, so-and-so's at work, he's not a Christian, he doesn't even believe in God, but he bears the fruit of the Spirit. He bears a lot of the fruits of the Spirit. No, he doesn't. You can have self-control. You can be patient. You can love someone, even sacrificially, and do what you truly believe or what they tell you is for their well-being, what they need. If it is not a result of following the Spirit's teachings, that is not the fruit of the Spirit. And so that just becomes a mere philosophy, a do-good type of a religion instead of a religion of faith and doing the Father's will. And you won't get to, and that's, people that talk about, God's going to if they're a good person, He's going to let them into heaven. That's salvation by works. Salvation by grace is conforming to God's standard and His standard alone, knowing that my righteous deeds are as filthy rags. It's what He dictates by His grace that I'm going to do and get to heaven by. Yes?
I mean, you can't obey God on accident.
Yeah, great
And
point.
in Romans 14, towards the end, when Paul sums up, he's talking more about eating and drinking, but he says, whatever you do, if it is not from faith, it is sin.
Yeah,
And faith coming from hearing the Word of God.
right. Even if it's a liberty, if you're doing it and hurting your conscience,
The point is that if it's not from faith, it has to be the product of faith.
Yeah.
It can't just be coincidentally in line with
That's an excellent point. You're not going to accidentally get into heaven, right? He makes 3 applications, and we won't look to these in detail. I think we're very familiar with these texts that he mentions. In 2 Peter chapter 1, he mentions that bearing fruit is what is included in spiritual growth, adding to your faith these different virtues. You notice there in 2 Peter chapter 1, he mentioned that the one who lacks these things, first in verse 8 he says, if these are yours and abound, you're not unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord. In other words, you're fruitful. But then he says in verse 9, if you lack these things, you're short-sighted and you've forgotten that you've been cleansed from your old sins. And what I think he's meaning by that is that when we were cleansed from our old sins, escape the corruption that is in the world through lust, verse 4, that was for the express purpose of being conformed to the image of Christ, partaking in the divine nature, walking in newness of life. So the person who obeys the gospel, their sins are cleansed, and they're just regressing or staying the same and not bearing fruit and abounding in these graces and these virtues. They're forgetting the whole point of God ever saving them in the first place, to make them a completely different person, transformed into the image of Christ. What are the two things in Matthew 25 which would amount to bearing fruit, according to that text? As he's using it in the book. We are loving our brethren, which is the next point. But in doing so, who are we loving and serving? Christ. That's extremely important because discipleship is about loyalty to Christ. And loyalty to Christ is expressed in a love to His people. And we need to always understand that when I'm doing this, it's not some dry obligation and meaningless act, a checklist, if you will. I'm actually doing this to Christ as I'm serving my brethren. And then secondly, which he has them in reverse order as far as the text is concerned, increasing our what? Talents, right? So, of course, talent being a type of money there, but, I think that it parallels with our abilities even. And so you have within your God-given talents things that are to be used in His glory and to His will, and you need to use them and multiply them. I've heard it said plenty of times by some brethren that, that's just not my talent. That's not for me. I want us to understand that talents, they are not stagnant or fixed, but we can grow into other things. And so I can do more now than I could do back when I was 12 years old and a fresh Christian. But I couldn't have if I would have always said, well, that's not my talent now, I'm not even going to try it. And so talents aren't stagnant. They're not fixed. They grow. They may have a limit. God knows that limit, but you don't know if you're not trying. And if you're not trying, you're burying your talent. And that man was condemned. All right, so let's move on to number 5. And the next demand is that we love our brethren. I'm falling behind on these, so I'll just go ahead and put them up. John chapter 13. And as you're turning there, our question number 13 that's next is, I think, an important one. If someone doesn't mind, read John 13, verses 34 through 35.
In this commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.
So, an identifying mark, thank you, Carl, of discipleship, a demand of discipleship, which will tell you that your disciple is loving your brethren. But question 13 is, what new commandment does Jesus give His disciples? Now, the answer is that you love one another as I have loved you. But He calls it a new commandment. Was the command to love your brethren new? So, if it wasn't, what does He mean by this is a new commandment? There is a specific standard, if you will, that He mentions in that verse. Yeah. What had Jesus not yet done? Died. Greatest act of love ever. He, in fact, would say in chapter 15, concerning love, in verse 13, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. He is, and in 1 John 3, you'll remember very well in verses 16 and 17, similar language, if He laid down His life, then we ought to for our brethren. And so here is an act of love that has yet to be exhibited in the world, and no other act will equal its power and efficacy. And to that love we're called, to sacrifice, lay down our lives for the good of our brethren, by the way, not just do any old thing, but again, within the standard, do what it takes for their benefit. Steve?
Go back to my old example of, I love my wife and I lay down my life for her, but will I take the trash out for her? Will I do the little things, for our brethren sometimes? I give my life for her, but will we make them a meal when they're sick? Or will we do, some of the little things we almost want to do the grandioso thing, but we don't want to do the day in, day out.
That's an excellent point, and a lot of times that's shrouded in a facade of humility. So, I could call them, send them a card. What is that really going to amount? What is that really going to do? And it's this kind of, it's bigger than me, and I can't really help. But really, that's pride, because just a cup of cold water is what Jesus said. It goes a long way. It's an immense deed. And Matthew 25, we do it for them. Yes, ma'am.
In James 2, where it's talking about your faith is dead if you don't have good works.
Yeah.
It's basically telling your brethren, go be blessed, but you don't do anything to meet the needs that they have.
That is an excellent point. And that's dead faith. That is saying, I have faith that the Lord will take care of you. Depart in peace, be warmed and filled. But knowing that God may be using me to answer that prayer, because that's how God works. He blesses His people through blessings with which He's blessed His other people, and I don't do that, then that's empty faith. That's not showing love at all. And I think plenty of us have been guilty of that, and we need to realize what we're doing when we say that. We're expressing faith, but then we're not acting by faith, and that's important. That's a great example. Anyone else have anything on that? All right, notice he mentions that there is no lone discipleship, and he mentions how we worship together. How are we going to do that acceptably without love, right? He mentions Philippians 4 and verse 3, which we remember those two women, Euodia and Syntyche, who couldn't get along, and he tells them, help them get along. Your brethren, you can't, someone has said, I love them, but I don't have to like them. That is not discipleship. That is not the family of God. That is not acceptable. And it's really not true. Those don't add up. And so you've got to be consistent in that. Lord, did you have something? Oh, you stick your hand up. So you got to be consistent with that. We just studied Colossians 3. He mentions, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And that's important. The way that we come together as that complete, mature man in Christ, as a unit and even as individuals, love binds us together in unity. He mentioned a lot of those different virtues that we express toward one another, and we build each other up and show each other love. Love is the umbrella which encompasses all of that. And so lastly, in 1 John 4, a very familiar passage to us, this really drives the point home. We talk about loving Jesus. We talk about caring for Jesus and how we lay our lives down for Jesus. And then, like Steve said, we don't even do the little things for our brethren. Well, notice in 1 John 4 and verse 12, he says, no one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and His love has been perfected in us. So notice in verse 20, following that same kind of thought process, not seeing God, but Him abiding in us. If someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? And this commandment we have from Him, that he who loves God must love his brother also. So we ought to be able to see God in each other. And if we're exhibiting these fruits that we're talking about before, we will be able to, valuing the spiritual above any kind of physical connection that we may or may not have. And if we get to that point, if we truly love Jesus, these things were going to come naturally. You cannot love God whom you have not seen if you're not even loving the brethren who belong to Him, by the way, who you see. Anything else on that? All right. Yes, Scott.
And you can have, different gifts, and love be your gift. I mean, I know somebody that I've never heard make a comment in class or read a scripture or lead a song, teach a class, but you know that they love the people in here by the things they do, the cards they give and the gifts
Yeah.
they give, and so when you can express love in many different ways, and it's everybody wants to be loved,
Right.
And while you're at it, be somebody that can be loved too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Don't be the angry Christian that's running around mad at everything and everybody,
Yeah.
and you're not showing love or getting it either.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's reciprocal, mutual. It's not a one-way street, right? And that is something. There are little facets of that other people are better than other people, but everyone is commanded to love. And so that's important, right?
There's a word that keeps coming up in these texts, it's abide. And in the previous text we talked about a minute ago, words were key to knowing how to abide.
Yes.
I think I've heard many sermons preached on abide.
Yeah.
To learn how that we really do that. Often people want to ignore the fact that it's about what did he say,
Right.
and what did he ask us to do.
Yeah, and abide is verb. The noun would be an abode, and so it's a permanency like your house, your residence. It's something you stay in, and so it's a constant thing. There's an ebb and flow of emotions and circumstances, but a constant is our love for the Lord and for His brethren, and we are directed in that, like Ronnie was saying. There are words that tell us how to do that. So, lastly, we must be committed to following Christ. He says in Luke 9 and verse 23, which is the verse for this lesson, that we take up our cross daily and follow me. That's a key word in that particular gospel in Luke 9:23. Daily. It's a daily thing. It's a constant thing. It's a committed thing. It's not a one-time thing. And so you can't be a true disciple in just, isolated instances. And part of that commitment, very quickly, Luke chapter 14, I trust you've read the text, is to count the cost. He talks about building a tower. Do you have enough to finish? Do you have enough to finish? But then as you count the cost of being the disciple, am I willing to pay that price? Do I have what it takes? In verses 31 through 32, he says, count the cost basically of not becoming his disciple. Because there's this king coming to wage war. He's got more than you. It's impossible to win. And what you need to do is send out for conditions of peace. You need to make sure you have what it takes to follow up and understand that it's not worth the cost of not putting forth that effort, because you will lose. So we need to remember that. So that's a fundamental, basic start to our study. And Lord willing, Sunday, James will start on lesson 2, which is about our commitment with the imagery of an athlete. Thank you for your attention.